You've spent your whole life believing a cowardly lie. They told you that if you were good, understanding, and always available, the world would reward you with respect, that your continuous kindness would be your impenetrable shield against human wickedness. Look around you. Did it work? Or do you feel deep down like a completely replaceable piece? Someone people desperately seek out when they need something, but forget the moment they're satisfied? The brutal truth, the one that shatters your romanticized view of the world, is that excessive availability doesn't breed gratitude. It breeds silent contempt. You smile when you should be silent. You give in when you should impose insurmountable boundaries. You burn vital energy trying to please, trying to maintain an illusory peace, trying to prove your worth to people who wouldn't hesitate to discard you at the first sign of inconvenience. And the invisible wound that bleeds inside you, the one you try to hide in the abyss of your mind when you're alone, is the cold, cutting realization that despite all your sacrificial effort, you are not truly respected. You are merely convenient. The common man, the mediocre man, lives eternally in this prison of neediness. He offers his own neck in the morbid hope that the predator will take pity. Machiavelli laughed at this naivete. He knew perfectly well that men have far fewer scruples about offending someone who makes themselves loved than someone who makes themselves feared. You think the problem is that you're not doing enough, but the real root of your ongoing social humiliation is exactly the opposite. You've cheapened your own presence. Your energy has become stagnant and predictable when it should be mystery, fire, and ice. But there is a tipping point, an exact moment when the power dynamic reverses, a single psychological shift, silent and lethal, that completely redefines the rules of the game. I'm not talking about changing your tone of voice, being arrogant, or making empty threats that betray desperation. The weak make noise because they need to be noticed. The powerful operate in absolute silence. I'm going to give you the key to a powerful identity transformation. I'm going to show you what happens when you apply this principle just once. A single change in attitude that shatters the mirror of others' expectations and forces people to look at you not with the familiarity of contempt, but with the overwhelming weight of a newfound, almost frightening respect. Now I'm going to show you where almost everyone destroys themselves right from the first step. What I'm about to reveal isn't a cheap tactic, but the invisible architecture of how the mind processes power and submission. But that's just the surface, and it leads us directly to the most humiliating mistake you don't even realize you're making. Understand an absolute law that has governed human interactions since the beginning of time. How others treat you is never about them. It's an exact, almost mathematical reflection of how you position yourself on the chessboard. The fatal mistake of the average person is to look at the behavior of others and see morality. You lament because people are ungrateful, because the world is unforgiving, and your continuous sacrifice is never validated. But human nature doesn't obey rules of justice or gratitude. It obeys instinctive dynamics of power, perception, and scarcity. Machiavelli didn't observe men expecting to find innate virtue. He dissected the anatomy of their passions and dark instincts, and the raw truth he perceived is exactly the same truth that continues to crush you today. What you call loyalty and kindness is, more often than not, nothing more than an invisible cry from your own ego begging for approval. You give your time, your silence, and your vital energy, not because you are an evolved spirit, but because you viscerally fear the emptiness of not being needed. This is not virtue. This is a deep-rooted psychological fragility, a grotesque crack in the foundation of your identity. The fool confuses unconditional availability with value. He bleeds voluntarily in public, surrendering his dignity in installments, hoping the crowd will crown him for his altruism. But the crowd never respects those who bleed in vain. It only feeds on weakness, devours sacrifice, and moves on, nurturing an unspeakable contempt for the prey that offered itself for slaughter. What we are dissecting here is not a simple behavioral trick of learning to say no. That's a palliative tactic for those with a servant's mind who only want to simulate strength for a few minutes. We are talking about an absolute philosophical reframing of your existence. It is the violent rupture between continuing to be the beggar at the door of someone else's palace and assuming, with weight and sobriety, the throne of your own mental dominion. True respect, that dense magnetism that chills the spine and immediately alters the tone of voice of whoever speaks to you, is born from an insurmountable self-sufficiency. It is born from the lethal awareness that your attention is your most precious weapon. The sovereign man never despairs to prove his worth. His simple, calculated retreat echoes louder than 1,000 speeches from the reactive and needy man. His mind ceases to be a stage of anxiety and becomes a fortress of ice. But there's an even deeper layer. because you can try to feign this posture, put on the temporary mask of detachment and forced coldness, but the unconscious of predators detects counterfeits from afar. Now pay attention, because this is where the game ceases to be external and becomes internal. Delve into the invisible machinery that silently governs each of your interactions. The human mind is a primitive and relentless machine, programmed by evolution to hunt what is difficult and summarily ignore what is abundant. When you position yourself as an inexhaustible resource, the eternal problem solver, the ever-present guarantee, you lethally sabotage the biology of respect. You deactivate in the other the fundamental instinct for conquest. The brain of the one who consumes you simply stops calculating your value, because infinite and cheap resources require no strategy to be maintained. You have become oxygen for them, utilitarian, perhaps essential in times of crisis, but completely invisible and never revered. The hidden mechanics of power are not based on the illusion of giving more of oneself, but on mastering the dark art of absolute containment. The mediocre reactive man is terrified of a vacuum. He vomits words to fill the silence, sends endless messages when ignored, and justifies himself until his presence loses all weight. By acting this way, he maps out his entire territory to the predator. He becomes tragically predictable, and in the silent game of human nature, predictability is the exact synonym for submission. When you are a space without borders, without passwords, and without restricted areas, people walk over you with dirty shoes and abandon you without looking back. Cheap familiarity is the silent poison that corrodes all reverence. You, driven by neediness, have handed over the keys to your mental fortress without demanding a drop of sweat from those who enter. True sovereignty is born only when you understand the brutal physics of withdrawal. Real power, the kind that bends spines, lies in creating intentional emotional asymmetry. When you cut off the flow of your validation, not with the predictable anger of a weakling, but with a calculated and glacial indifference, you short-circuit the other person's ego. The sudden vacuum of your absence creates unbearable tension in the mind of the one who believed they had you in the palm of their hand. At that very millisecond when obscure doubt annihilates presumptuous certainty, the throne changes hands. The mechanism is cold. Value dwells in the abyss of scarcity. But without the next step, you remain easy prey, because understanding the mechanism doesn't prevent you from reacting like a fool when the pressure mounts, and that leads us to the most humiliating mistake of all. The moment you are tested, ignored, or disrespected is the exact moment your weakest self betrays you in public. Think coldly about your last defeat. What did you do when you were sidelined? The cycle of humiliation for the average person is terribly predictable. They feel a pathetic urgency to fix the situation and demand explanations. The weakling sends gigantic texts, spewing resentment in the childish illusion of generating remorse. They confuse emotional outbursts with demanding respect, without understanding that uncontrolled anger intimidates no one. It only proves that their walls have crumbled. When you react with your pain exposed, you hand over control of your mental state to your tormentor. The reactive person is a slave to their own insecurity. They cannot bear the crushing weight of silence, so they talk, argue, and plead until they drown in their own despair. They try to prove their worth in a psychological court where they have already been secretly condemned to contempt. With each additional word you utter in an attempt to be understood, your value plummets into the abyss. You become a torn book devoid of any mystery. The mediocre man blindly believes that if he screams his pain loudly enough, the predators will have mercy. But the world merely watches with a mocking smile as he empties his own crown and surrenders the jewels of his sanity in exchange for dust. The most tragic thing is that the opponent didn't even need to unsheath their sword. You collapse, stumbling over your own neediness. This is the mechanics of your daily downfall. You try to be dangerous, but you act like someone terrified of abandonment. You try to set boundaries, but your gaze begs for approval, and the predator in front of you reads every invisible crack in your weakness. But this voluntary submission bleeds you to death from now on. There is a singular movement, an invisible blow to the other's psychological structure, the so would you, that brutally and silently reverses this power dynamic. This is where you cease to be the emotional prey and become the master of the game. Now pay attention, because the next point changes everything. Change begins the moment you kill your unhealthy need to respond. The first mental weapon you will wield is silent, requires no effort, and leaves no trace. I call it absolute withdrawal. The weak, intoxicated by their own insecurity, believe that power resides in confrontation, in desperate arguments, and in the pathetic attempt to have the last word. The sovereign knows that real power, the kind that irremediably destabilizes the mind of another, resides in the summary negation of the battlefield. When they try to diminish you, deliberately ignore you, or test your limits, your conditioned instinct will scream for defense. That is precisely when you must freeze your emotions. You will not justify yourself. You will simply withdraw your presence and your focus, like a king who rises and turns his back without granting the provocateur the dignity of a single syllable. From today onward, silence becomes an icy blade pressed against the throat of another's ego. When you execute this maneuver, the board flips with an invisible violence. The manipulator who relied on your emotional outbursts to feed and feel validated faces an insurmountable wall of ice. Your total lack of reaction creates a terrifying vacuum in the mind of the one who tried to hurt you. They expected fire. You delivered the abyss. Without the exposed map of your emotions, the predator is blinded and instantly loses the compass of control. This is the first visceral experience of mental superiority you will taste. You become untouchable. Anxiety changes sides. You are no longer the territory they invade at will. You have transformed into a dark fortress where provocations die of starvation. Your energy, previously bled dry in sterile arguments, returns to your center. You begin to observe the disguised despair of the other, who will do anything to elicit any meager reaction from you, but you will not yield a drop of sweat. Applying absolute withdrawal is simply about taking control of your own territory. What happens next in the social chess game is where the true alchemy of power materializes before your eyes. Now I'm going to show you how people collapse and start orbiting you, but pay attention because this is where the game stops being defensive and becomes a dangerous spectacle of domination. The moment you establish the icy silence of your emotional detachment, the fabric of your social reality tears and reconfigures itself. People who previously treated you with the indifference reserved exclusively for the weak and predictable suddenly feel the suffocating weight of an altered atmosphere. The usual disdain gives way to a primal and somber confusion. They observe you like predators who, in trying to tear apart their usual prey, have broken their teeth against a wall of solid steel. Your calculated silence injects unbearable tension into the environment. You cease to be the needy flatterer, the endless and worthless resource, and ascend to the position of an impenetrable sphinx. The human mind is absolutely addicted to puzzles, and by obliterating your instinctive reactions, you become the most dangerous and magnetic enigma in the room. Observe with a cold, grotesque spectacle, the grotesque spectacle of human nature bowing before your newfound sovereignty. Those who deliberately ignored you will begin to orbit your space like disoriented satellites. They will launch invisible probes in search of any crumb of your former validation. They will use subtle provocations, disguised compliments, or childish displays of power, silently begging you to revert to being the reactive puppet you once were. The average manipulator will suffer a complete nervous breakdown. Without the blood of your emotion to drink, his arsenal rots in his own hands. You will see social masks crumbling and arrogant postures melting into pools of brutal insecurity. Men do not respect what they easily understand. They revere only what they fear and cannot control. And nothing terrifies and seduces the ego of others more than the overwhelming realization that you have become untouchable. Your magnetism will not come from the words you speak, but from the terrifying abyss you refuse to fill. But don't be intoxicated by the easy allure of this newfound power over the external world. Controlling others' perceptions and bending the expectations of those around you is only the first phase of your ascent. The true enemy, the one who can sabotage your crown before dawn, has never been on the outside. But there is an even deeper layer, where the overwhelming majority crumble and return to the humiliating addiction of weakness. And it is here that the game ceases to be external and becomes brutally internal. You marveled at the impact of your coldness on others' behavior. You were intoxicated by the fleeting sensation of control over the chessboard. But now we need to descend into the dampest and darkest dungeon of your own mind. The raw truth, the one that makes cowards instinctively look away from the mirror, is that your humiliating need for approval was never a harmless accident of your personality. It has always been a vice branded into the soft tissue of your ego. When you cut off the validation of others, imposing the law of ice in your absence, you also violently sever the main source that fed your own vital illusions. The silence that drives the manipulator mad and disorients them out there is exactly the same silence that now reverberates lethally and terrifyingly within your invisible wound. Be brutally honest with the abyss for a second. Why did you give in so much? Why did you offer your neck so willingly to the predators? Because hidden beneath the virtuous mask of kindness existed an absolute and paralyzing terror of not belonging, an overwhelming dread of rejection. The common, mediocre man prefers to crawl for the crumbs of poisoned attention rather than endure the relentless majesty of his own solitude. This is the darkest and most nauseating layer of human nature. You were never merely a helpless victim of those around you. You were the most dedicated accomplice in your own psychological enslavement. Day after day, you traded the crown of your sovereignty for the cheap anesthesia of social acceptance. Maintaining the unwavering stance of absolute withdrawal will not be a mere exercise in external discipline. It will trigger in you a brutal and silent emotional withdrawal syndrome. Your own ego, like a hungry parasite deprived of oxygen, will writhe in the shadows of your mind. It will whisper comforting lies, desperately screaming for you to lower your defensive weapons, begging you to send that conciliatory message, to try to explain yourself just one more time in search of a last drop of that putrid validation that destroyed you. It is precisely in this internal minefield that false kings prematurely lose their throne. They manage to wear the heavy armor of the strategist for only a few days, but when indifference becomes thick, the terrified boy who dwells within them breaks down the fortress doors from the inside and crawls weeping back to the feet of those who always humiliated him. Your lethal and true war is not against the ungrateful people who refuse to respect you. Your ultimate battle, without applause or witnesses, is against the pathetic part of you that still feels a morbid and uncontrollable compulsion to be accepted by them. The festering umbilical cord of your neediness must be severed with a blunt blade, without anesthesia and without pity. If you don't annihilate the inner enemy that sabotages the trenches of your mind, all the tactics in the world will be nothing more than makeup running down the face of an essentially submissive man. But the real problem hasn't fully surfaced yet, because whoever merely endures the pain will eventually bleed to utter and inevitable exhaustion. Now pay attention, because this is where technical control ends and the definitive breakdown begins, and this leads us to the most dangerous part of your entire journey. There will come a crucial and lonely moment when pure technique will completely lose its meaning. If you only feign coldness, if you use absolute withdrawal as a cheap trick to force reactions in the other, the weight of that mask will inevitably crush your spine. The man who only acts, who calculates every silence as a mere cog in the machine of manipulation, lives with the silent terror of having his charade discovered. He remains a slave to his own neediness, only dressed in the illusory armor of a strategist, but there is a dark threshold, an irreversible point of no return on the mental chessboard. It is the surgical moment when you stop applying silence and inexorably become silence itself. This is the brutal instant of your identity rupture. The old you, malleable, emotional, reactive, and desperate for affection, doesn't need to be adjusted, medicated, or understood. It needs to be dragged by the collar to the edge of the abyss and pushed into the darkness without a single trace of remorse. When you cross that unforgiving threshold, indifference ceases to be a shield you erect with extreme effort and becomes the natural heavy gravity of your presence. You will perceive a lethal change in your own blood. It will no longer be necessary to grit your teeth to avoid justifying yourself in the face of others' injustice, because the pathetic urgency to do so has rotted and died within you. It is the definitive psychological cremation of who you were. The sovereign does not force distance. He simply retreats, because the rare frequency at which he now operates makes the dramas, provocations, and games of the common man unbearably vulgar. Those who once hurt you will seek the cracks of pain in your eyes, but will only stumble upon the icy abyss of one who has assumed exclusive and non-negotiable possession of their own spirit. You become a mirror of steel, reflecting the baseness of the frustrated predator while maintaining your undefeated, mysterious, and lethally untouchable essence. You annihilate your own dependence because you achieve a razor-sharp lucidity. You finally understand that needing to be loved was the thorny collar that kept you trapped in the kennel of mediocrity. The man who masters the shadows of his own ego becomes the most indomitable creature on earth, the one who doesn't need handouts to know he is king. But the new identity demands an eternal throne, and isolated tactics do not sustain empires. Now I will show you the philosophical vision that consolidates this power forever, and it is here that your transition reaches a peak of superiority unattainable for the vast majority. What you have just forged in the fire of your own solitude is not a mere technique for social survival. Tactics are cheap crutches for weak men who still fear their own shadow. What we have sculpted here, layer by layer, is a brutal, relentless, and definitive philosophy of existence. The external world is merely a mechanical representation, a gigantic and merciless mirror of your inner posture. When your will is weak, guided by neediness and the silent terror of rejection, reality treats you as a willing slave, whipping your dignity because you yourself surrendered the chains. But when your will becomes sovereign, non-negotiable, and shielded by the ice of calculated indifference, the very structure of life bends to accommodate the crushing weight of your presence. From this millisecond onward, your existence ceases to be a humiliating negotiation for affection. You no longer ask permission to exist, nor do you auction off your peace in the vulgar markets of others' attention. Absolute withdrawal abandons its status as mere defense and transforms into your existential geometry. It is the unbreakable golden rule of your new mental empire. Your presence is the rarest privilege anyone can access, and your silence is the automatic guillotine for any trace of disrespect. The reactive man bleeds and screams, trying to alter the behavior of the outside world. The rare man anchors himself in the dark abyss of his own dominion and watches with the cold, calm eyes of a satiated predator as the world desperately reconfigures itself around him. This is the terrifying and magnificent face of true sovereignty. It is not the hysterical cry of someone trying to impose respect through brute force or anger, but the majestic silence of the mountain that does not move an inch to please the wind. You have finally unraveled the invisible gears of human power. You have ceased to be the gasping prey that justifies itself, and have become the dark labyrinth where manipulators collapse and lose themselves. The absolute respect you spent your entire life begging on your knees is now nothing more than docile dust under the soles of your boots. You and only you are the merciless architect of your own throne. But forging the crown in the fire of your mind doesn't mean your ride is over. Now comes the final consolidation, the point where knowledge becomes blood, and this leads us to the definitive separation between those who merely listen and those who dominate. The old version of you, begging for attention and bleeding to be accepted, is dead. The ashes of that deep weakness have been swept away by the unwavering ice of your new posture. What you carry from now on is not a temporary tactical mask, but the heavy, cold, and non-negotiable crown of true mental sovereignty. You have crossed the fire of your own neediness and emerged on the other side as something that the common man will never understand, but will be eternally forced to respect viscerally, where before there was loose, exposed ground ready to be trampled by the usual manipulators. Today stands a dark, relentless, and insurmountable fortress. You have mastered the invisible mechanics of human nature because you had the lethal audacity to first annihilate the shackles of your own ego. The mirror no longer reflects the pathetic shadow of the prey. It displays the icy silhouette of the architect of your own abyss. But engrave this final truth in your mind with blood. The path of extreme lucidity is brutally arid for those who dare to walk it alone. The great mass out there will remain an endless ocean of fools, hysterical reactants, and slaves to their own emotions. To bear the weight of this dark throne requires more than isolated understanding. It requires you to walk among your equals. If your spirit recognizes the somber gravity of these words, if your pulse beats with the clarity of one who has finally awakened from the slumber of mediocrity to embrace real power, then you have ceased to be a mere spectator of social weaknesses. You have just been initiated into a far rarer and more dangerous lineage. Subscribe to this channel now. Seal your definitive entry into the tribe of those who operate in the shadows of strategy, restraint, and absolute psychological superiority. Scroll down to the comments and write the phrase, "Silence is my throne." Make this your invisible oath, the ritualistic decree before the world that your lack has been beheaded forever. The rules have been violently rewritten. This is your new domain. Take control.